All right, welcome to Touchdown Talks. I'm Spencer Taylor. This is going to be my mid-season predictions, really adjustments to my predictions that I made before the 2024 season began. I did this last season on my podcast. Wasn't on YouTube at the time, but if you go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can find those for the 2023 season and how I did it. But basically, some broadcasters, everybody does it their own way for fun, but what I've liked to do this last couple seasons is I make predictions for the season for each team before the season begins, and then I allow myself to, I take the time, I watch the games for the first half of the season, see how my predictions worked out, and then at the midway point through the season, we've got a bit of a better grasp of how teams are looking as far as the bigger picture of things. And so at the mid-season point, I then give myself one chance to make any changes I want to my predictions for the rest of the season going forward based off of what has already happened. And, to some extent, as I learned last year with my predictions when I did that, honestly, half the time, the predictions I make before the season even began end up still being more accurate for specific teams than the ones that I made mid-season. And then, sometimes it's the other way around. You would expect that ones I make closer to the actual outcome, you would think those are more accurate. But again, as I've discussed before, sometimes with predictions, it helps to have more information. Sometimes, though, with making predictions when it comes to the NFL, sometimes it's actually easier to predict more accurately when you're farther away from recent games, things like that. Sometimes recency bias can, mess with your perception of what is likely going to happen in the NFL. And we are exactly at the midway point. As I record this, this is currently Wednesday night. This will be coming out Thursday night, just before Week 10 kicks off for the NFL. So that'll be when you'll be watching this, right around the beginning of Week 10. The exact midway point as far as the number of games played in the regular season was actually the end of Sunday night for Week 9, so we're just barely over the midway point. We're also within 100 days from the Super Bowl, so I know if you're like me, unfortunately that's kind of sad news for football fans. We've high school football already pretty much wrapped up. Most states, they're going to be in playoffs for high school at least. College, really getting down to that final stretch, and then you'll have playoffs and stuff going into January. But NFL, fortunately, as far as the regular season goes, we still have a half of the season left to go. So without further ado, let's get into my mid-season predictions. If you want to see in-depth of what my preseason predictions are, those videos are up on the channel, either for my predictions right before this season started or back in May when the schedule released. I have videos for both of those. You can find those on the channel here. But let's get into my mid-season predictions. So first of all, let's just go division by division. We will start in the AFC North. I feel like the AFC North going forward is the easier one to predict, especially as far as playoff teams, especially the top playoff teams. We pretty much already know who the four division winners are going to be in the AFC. So starting with the AFC North, this is actually probably the hardest division to predict as far as the winner goes, but certainly the favorite at this point would be the Baltimore Ravens at the moment. Now, where the standings sit right now, it may not look that way, but I do predict the Baltimore Ravens will win the division as was expected coming into the season. I now have the Ravens predicted to win 13 games. That would put them at the number 2 seed in the AFC. And then out of the AFC North, I do think the Pittsburgh Steelers, they've had an amazing season. Even if they, slightly drop in win percentage going forward the rest of the season, they still end up with above a 500 record, well above it even, outdoing expectations that most of us had, certainly expectations that I had for the Steelers coming into it. Huge credit to Mike Tomlin. he definitely knows what he's doing, and even with their situation at quarterback with Justin Fields and then actually giving Russell Wilson the start once he was healthy, most people were doubting that and questioning that move. And so far in the last couple weeks that they've done that, it's worked out for them. And even the weeks that they did have Justin Fields in, both quarterbacks, the Steelers, have been able to play really well with that great defense they always have. And even on offense with those two quarterbacks, both are playing some of their best football this season that they've had of their career, at least in years, when it comes to Russell Wilson. Rest of the AFC, Cleveland, obviously, they're not going to be. They've had a horrible season, nightmare season. I don't see very many wins at all for the rest of the season. I think they'll win in a couple weeks here against New Orleans, maybe get a win against Cincinnati. Otherwise, I don't think they got many more wins left. Cincinnati as well, I do think they will have a better win percentage in the second half of the season to what they did in the first half, but they've just dug themselves into too much of a hole. I think they end at 7-10, and obviously, predictably with that record, miss the playoffs. I don't think the Bengals are a playoff team. I do think they will look a lot more like it in the second half of the season, but with the hole they've dug themselves, they pretty much need to run the table, and being that they have plenty of in-division games that are going to be tough, and also other games that could go not their way as well, it's going to be really hard for them to run the table and be able to make the playoffs, which is pretty much what they need to do, even just to be a wild card team at this point. Moving on to the AFC East, this is a division easier to predict. Buffalo Bills, I have them winning it. I have them finishing with a record of 13-4, and I do have the Buffalo Bills ending as the only team out of the AFC East to make the playoffs. That's not much different from my predictions before the season started. I'm sorry, but I was not a believer of the Jets. Still am not. They've had a good week. This past week went well for them. They finally got a win, but they're in a huge hole. They like the Bengals. If they were to even have a chance to make a wild card spot, they would need to run the table. And I do want to say, for the AFC, I've mentioned it the last couple weeks, running the table or getting into the wild card, certainly going to be much easier than it would be in the NFC. But even so, with the holes that Cincinnati or the Jets have dug themselves into already, I just don't think it's very realistic. And certainly between the Bengals and the Jets, it's way more realistic, in my opinion, for the Bengals to hope so. But really, either team, I don't like their chances. I have the Jets ending at 7-10 for the season. That was where I had them before the season started, and actually both before the season and now here at midseason. I do have the Jets still finishing at 7-10. However, before the season started, I thought they might finish third in the division. I now think they'll finish second in the division. Again, not because their record is different by my projections. The difference is the Miami Dolphins. Unfortunately, they've just had a horrible first half of the season. They do have Tua back currently, but even with him back, they've now lost 2 straight heartbreaking games, losing 2 field goals in the final minutes, or final seconds, really, of the last 2 games. So the Dolphins have way too huge of a hole, and even with Tua in the game, I mean, Tyreek Hill hasn't had a great season at all this year. There's questions even now about the coaching there. I just don't think this is a good year for Miami at all. And then New England, we know that, of course, they're going to be they're playing for draft position, honestly, at this point. They've got a lot of holes. AFC South, this one, another easier one to predict. This one was certainly coming into the season, felt like a lot more of a toss-up, but at this point, the picture has cleared up. Tennessee, they're where we expected they were going to be. I didn't change my prediction for them much. I've only got them ending with 3 wins, which is 1 win higher than I had predicted for them beginning of the season, but that's still not good at all. Jacksonville, they've way underperformed my predictions, and they've still got Doug Peterson. I wouldn't be surprised if he stays on as the head coach for the rest of the season, but yeah, they've underperformed. Trevor Lawrence has regressed, not been looking good this season, and they've got some tough games. I think, unfortunately, I don't think they're going to be able to handle the rest of their season in order to even make the wild card. Indianapolis, they were another one of those teams that I thought out of the AFC South could have given Houston some trouble, maybe got into the wild card, but Anthony Richardson hasn't played well this season at all. Even Joe Flacco coming in hasn't looked like he did with the Browns last season. So Indianapolis, just not a good season for them as well. Houston, they've been really good, but in ways they've also been kind of disappointing. Certainly feels like CJ Stroud is kind of having a sophomore slump compared to what he had last year as a rookie. So either way, though, I do think at this point, Houston, pretty easy favorites to win their division. So I do have them winning it, and I do have them as the most likely 4th seed in the AFC. And then that brings us to the final division in the AFC, being the AFC West. This was probably the most predictable as far as who was going to win it. That is the Chiefs. The change I do have for my Chiefs prediction is I think they're winning more games than I predicted before the season. I thought I was being possibly overgenerous to the Chiefs before the season started, but I'm now thinking that might not even be the case. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if they go 16-1. I mean, plenty of people at this point are questioning whether or not the Chiefs are going to go undefeated. I don't think so. I mean, I think going undefeated is obviously, if you look at it historically, very hard, nearly impossible in the NFL. And certainly nowadays, with the longer schedule even, we do have an extra game, even harder to run the table and go undefeated. And the other thing is not only is that just challenging as it is, but for a team, especially one like the Chiefs, going undefeated isn't really the goal. Obviously, that's something that they would love to do. It'll be something that'll be celebrated if they do it. But the Chiefs, we all know, they're going for that three-peat. They've gotten the back-to-back Super Bowl, so now they're going for the history of being the first team to three-peat. So the Super Bowl is really what they're going for, and so going undefeated, not going to be their goal. I mean, if they get to December, thing is, the schedule makers didn't do the Chiefs any favors towards the end of the season. They've got a lot of primetime games, and with that, they've got some weird, they've got some pretty short weeks multiple times here in November and December, including at the very end. They play a Saturday game the week before Christmas, and then they play on Christmas Day in Pittsburgh. So like that for example feels like a game that the Chiefs could very well end up losing. Even this next couple weeks, they play Denver this week. That feels like it could be a trap game. It's a division game. Also, there's plenty of stats out there for teams just simply going 8-0. The next week, in week 9, historically is one of the weeks that 8-0 teams end up falling. Then they go on the road to Buffalo. I think the Chiefs will take that game very seriously, so it's possible they still end up winning that one. And then they've got some pretty easy games in there, but again, once you get into December, again, some scheduling stuff that doesn't go the Chiefs' way. And again, even if you stay undefeated all the way up until Christmas, by that point, you're going to have already won 15 games at that point. So you might at that point want to think about resting players, sitting Patrick Mahomes, stuff like that. Maybe you start Carson Wentz, start a good amount of second string guys just to keep people healthy. You end the season in Denver, and then you want to be healthy for the playoff run. Obviously, the Chiefs likely will end up also with the first round bye in the playoffs, but still, you want to make sure you're healthy, especially with those weird scheduling situations that they have in December. So I think for the Chiefs, it's very unlikely they go undefeated, but it's still possible. And I'm projecting them to win 16, lose 1 somewhere, whether that's to Pittsburgh, to Buffalo, maybe 1 to Denver. I think they do at least win 1 game, but that's certainly higher than where I had projected them before the season at about 14-3. The rest of the division, about where I expected them to be. Raiders rounding out the bottom, Denver in third, and then Chargers in second. I knew Denver and the Chargers were probably going to be somewhere in the middle. Both have really good coaches now, and I do think Jim Harbaugh and Sean Payton are really getting those franchises built up. Obviously, both franchises, need another draft or two to really become top tier contenders, but you can already tell with both coaching staffs what they're trying to do, and it's already working to some extent. And honestly, I think with these new projections, the thing that is new for me out of the AFC West that's honestly kind of shocking is I have 3 playoff teams from the AFC West currently. So the Chiefs, obviously, the number 1 seed, and then the number 6 and number 7 seed is the Chargers and the Broncos, which with these records you're seeing here on the screen might sound a little crazy, but with that, let's go really quick, show the AFC playoff picture, and this is why. I think in the AFC, you'll see it here when we go into the NFC. The AFC, the bottom middle section, those teams that are going to be in the wild card hunt, I think the standard of winning that's going to be required to make the playoffs is much lower than in the NFC. The AFC really top heavy, but then after that it gets kind of flexible in there, and so I think it's very possible we end up seeing a team or two in those bottom 2 AFC wildcard slots that are 10 wins, 9 wins. So by my projections, looking at their schedules going ahead, I do have that being the Chargers at 10-7, and then Denver at 9-8, rounding out the AFC. Now moving over to the NFC. For the NFC North, I have the Detroit Lions winning the division, also winning the conference number 1 seed and the bye. They go 15-2. For Detroit, they've lost 1 game so far this season, and I only see really one. I mean, they do have plenty of losable games, but it's Detroit. They certainly, for the NFC, they are separating. They feel like that team that is just at a whole nother level in the NFC, kind of like the Chiefs do. The Chiefs are more of a boring, more, again, some people say less scary version, but the Chiefs the Lions are that team that on the AFC side, they are scary. They're a tough team. They can score. They proved this past week in Lambeau. They can play outdoors as well in the weather. So indoors, outdoors, they're going to beat you up. They've got a huge run game, a good pass game. They've got a good tough defense. Dan Campbell has really infused his culture there, and they're making better decisions situationally as well as a team. So they're a scary team, and I don't see very many losses for them coming up. The one I've got them scheduled to lose might be Buffalo. If not that, maybe you drop one to Minnesota or to the 49ers in the last couple weeks of the season. But yeah, I don't see the Detroit Lions losing much. For the rest of the division, this, of course, one of the biggest changes out of my predictions from back before the season started, Minnesota Vikings. I now am projecting them to win 12 games this season, which is far higher than what I had predicted for them back before the season started. I think I had predicted them to be at like 7-10. So the Minnesota Vikings have very much outperformed expectations, and I do think, we've seen this last couple weeks, them have some struggles now, lose a game or two, and I do think they still got another loss or two ahead. I'm currently predicting them to lose 3 more games this season, but that's only 3, and we're halfway through the season. So they end at 12-5. That gets Minnesota a wild card berth. That gives them the number 6 seed. I know that sounds low, again, being what we saw in the AFC, but for the NFC, you'll see when I get to the total AFC playoff picture, I think the records that you're going to have by those NFC wildcard teams are going to be surprisingly pretty high looking. So then Packers, Bears, those two, Packers about where I had them before the season started. Third in the NFC North. I do think the Packers sneak into the playoffs. I think they get that 6th or 7th seed most likely. That's where I had them before the season started. They have in ways outperformed my expectations, but in other ways, Jordan Love, very much looks like a Brett Favre. Any play, it can either be one of the best plays you've ever seen or one of the worst interceptions or decisions you've ever seen. But with that, they've got a great coaching staff, a good young roster. So they're certainly a competitive team that can hang with almost anybody, and I do think they end up in the in the NFC wild card in a pretty tough conference. And then the Bears, 7-10 is my prediction for them now. Unfortunately, I just this first half of the season, really this first 10-11 week, the first 10 weeks of the season for the Bears were the weeks that they really needed to stack up the wins if they were going to have any chance to sneak into the playoffs this season. And unfortunately, they're just looking way too much like they did in 2023. I think Matt Eberflus, again, no surprise, this was a lame duck year. It certainly felt like that unless he was able to do some amazing stuff with the team, and it's just not happening. The Bears' defense just isn't looking as crazy good as it would need to. The Bears' offense still underperforming. Very much looks like it needs an offensive coach on board. So, the offensive line has regressed. That's causing Caleb Williams to regress. I mean, we were seeing him gain some momentum. We were seeing the offense as a whole gain momentum for a couple weeks there. And then, the bye hit, some losses as well around that. And the Bears they just don't seem well coached, especially on offense. But, even defense was stuff with the Hail Mary against Washington. The week since then, leading up to the Cardinals, they just got destroyed by the Cardinals. They just haven't felt well coached during losses. That's the thing is teams that are really well coached, they know how to handle losses and they know how to handle winning. And the Bears just don't seem to be well coached enough to know how to handle that. So I do have them rounding out the NFC North at 7-10. Then finishing the AFC, going into the AFC East, I have Philadelphia winning the division. I think it's going to be a very tight race between Philadelphia and the Washington Commanders. Definitely different than what I would have guessed before the season started. I would have guessed Philly and Dallas would have been fighting for that top spot. But no, Dallas way underperforming. We all know that. I've got them now projected to go 6-11, so that'll be a huge downturn for Dallas from what they've been this last few years. Giants round out the division. That's no surprise. But yeah, at the top of the AFC, I have both the Eagles and the Commanders finishing at 13-4. I do have the Eagles winning that tiebreaker based off of division win total. So I do have them both splitting the rivalry between the two of them. And then, yeah, it'll be division wins in my predictions that has the Eagles getting the tiebreaker over the Commanders. So Eagles will get the number 2 seed in the NFC, and then the Washington Commanders, they will be the 5 seed in the wild card. Going into the NFC South, this one was one of the more predictable divisions coming into this season, and it's shaped out pretty much how I expected, almost to a T, honestly. I think this is one of the most predictable divisions in this league so far this season. With the exception of the fact that even though the positioning within the division was really predictable, I will say the Falcons have outperformed my expectations. Currently, I have them projected to finish at 12-5. Before the season, I had them winning the division, but only finishing right above 500. So, they've outperformed that a little bit. I do think they win the division. Tampa Bay, I think they're a team that certainly would make the AFC wild card if they were in that conference, but for the NFC wild card that's going to require more wins, I just don't think that the Buccaneers are going to have it. I, both before the season and now, projecting them to win 9 games, which is just not going to be enough. I think had they been able to stay healthy on offense, they would have actually gotten more, maybe snuck in to that number 7 seed. But, with losing Chris Godwin for the season, losing Mike Evans, I know they've got him possibly coming back soon, but the amount of time they've already missed with those two, they've already, they've lost some games that you would hope they hadn't. I mean, they did pretty good against the Chiefs. Narrowly lost that, of course. Um, I think without the injuries, they might have beat Atlanta. But yeah, they just, I don't think they're making the playoffs. The rest of the division, New Orleans just fired their head coach. Carolina, they're at the bottom. Both of those two, not too surprising. I knew this was going to be a dysfunctional year for both of those franchises. And then final division for the NFC, we have the NFC West. This one's a bit of a surprise for me this season. I knew the 49ers, I was expecting the 49ers to regress to some extent. I did expect them to have a better win total. Before the season started, I predicted them to win 12 games, and I expected that to be only enough for second in their division. I now currently have them projected to win 11 games and win their division. And then the change there is I had predicted the Rams to win the division. I now have them as just barely missing the wild card picture. Rams 10-7, that would not make the wild card, with Green Bay getting the last playoff spot at 11-6. So the Rams at 10-7 to miss the playoffs, that would be pretty heartbreaking. But unfortunately, I think just some of those losses early in the season, while they were missing Cooper Kupp and Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, I think those are going to have hurt them too much. And I think the 49ers, it sounds like they very well might be getting Christian McCaffrey back finally. He'll finally get his 2024 season debut. I think with that, the 49ers are going to start picking things up here. They've got some winnable games, so I think 49ers are going to rise to the top. I mean, of course, currently where the NFC West sits, all the teams are basically right at 500, really close to each other. But I do think the order of them by the end, as you can see here, it'll kind of sort itself out to more of an order that we would have guessed before the season. And yeah, for the Rams, barely missing out. Same with the Cardinals, actually. They end at 9-8 is my projection now. And again, in the AFC, that might have gotten you into the wild card, but the NFC, that's not going to cut it. Seahawks, I don't think they're that good. This is pretty much where I predicted them before the season as well, and my opinion on them hasn't changed. They've outperformed a little bit of what I expected, but not enough to make any meaningful difference in the standings. And then now to finish it, NFC playoff picture, you do have Lions up at the top. They'll get the first round bye. Then the Eagles, as I said, they win the tiebreaker over Washington, so they get the number 2 seed. Then Atlanta, the NFC South, finally gets a division winner that's not the 4 seed for a year. And then 49ers, they get that number 4 seed. And then the wild card picture in the NFC will be Commanders, Vikings, Packers. I think both of these two AFC, NFC playoff pictures that I've got sound very interesting. I think we are gearing up for a very interesting 2024 playoffs. Of course, we're only halfway through the season. These are just my projections. Let me know down below in the comments what you think of these. Who do you think is going to be in the playoffs? What's your playoff picture projections? Let me all know all that down below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe down below. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any further videos, and I will see you in the next one.